Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I am your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm really pleased to have with me once again F. William Engdahl. William is the author of several books, and well, he's become a fairly regular guest on this show. I really do appreciate his work. He documents what he's writing very, very well. And The Gods of Money was one book that I read that I found extremely helpful when it comes to understanding American history. And again, very well documented. It's not what you'll read in textbooks. The textbooks have their own propaganda, I suppose. After all, our educational system is one that is run by the state. It's not a free educational system. Free in the sense that you don't pay. Well, we do. We pay our taxes. But in terms of somebody having the curiosity to explore for the truth, well, that's kind of discouraged. But it's people like William Engdahl that really helps us along those lines. But The Lost Hegemon, Whom the Gods Would Destroy, is the most recent book, and I find the articles that William writes to be very much in sync with that book, and so we're very glad to have him with us again today. Thanks for joining me, William.
Glad to be with you again, Jay.
Always good to have you, and I should mention it's William Engdahl, ENGDAHL.com. I hope I have that spelled right, because my wife tells me I always spell your name wrong. William Engdahl.
That's right.
Okay, WilliamEngdahl.com. Go there to avail yourself to some wonderful essays, articles on current events that are so, so important. So I urge my listeners to partake of William's insights.
I just started a new feature on the website for people who go on there, and they are invited to get a free biweekly newsletter. It's a short thing, but it's a supplement to the articles that I write.
Oh, so, good.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Thanks for sharing that. I'll have to definitely take advantage of that. I think it was on March 31st. There was a special G20 meeting. There's going to be a meeting, as I understand it. Correct me, help me understand this. I believe there's going to be a G20 meeting, and the people's and China is the host to this meeting. Is that right?
China is the chair of the group of 20. It's 20 different countries, emerging countries like China, Brazil, and so forth, and the countries such as the U.S., Canada, Italy, France, Germany, and the UK. And China is the current president.
Okay, but there's a series of these meetings throughout the year, is that right? And then
these are pre-meetings to shape the agenda for the actual meeting later this year.
Right. So it's the G7 countries that are all in there, plus the 13 others, I guess.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Okay, so you're talking about China really wanting to promote the special drawing rights, SDRs as they're called, and we've had guests on this show talking about that. A lot. What can you tell us about the meeting that occurred? I think it was on March 31st. What do you make of the absence of? You said there's an absence of senior U.S. Treasury members there. What's that all about?
Well, let me say what was remarkable about the meeting. It was held in Paris on the request of the Chinese. The chairman of the Bank of China, the central bank, the governor, Zhao Zhuochuan, was present, and he made the major presentation calling for broader use of IMF special drawing rights. Now, China was admitted last November as a member of this basket of currencies, which is what it is. It was developed during the late 60s, 70s to try to get around the dollar crisis at that point, and has been kind of there ever since, but it's a basket of currencies. It's not a alternative currency. You can't go to a bank and get so many SDRs. You get a basket which includes a percentage of US dollars, a percentage of Japanese yen, a percentage of British pound, a percentage of German mark, and now the euro. And now, Japanese yen, if I didn't mention, and now the Chinese renminbi is a member of that. It's now five different currencies. And the Central Bank of China, Governor Zhao, wants to have a subtle transition of the global monetary system that one currency, the US dollar, does not dominate everything. So to call for more use of the SDRs means that countries' payments can be in the other currencies, such as the euro, such as the renminbi. And that would be perfectly in order. Well, Washington will fight that tooth and nail. That's the reason that I'm sure that the U.S. Treasury Secretary was not invited to that meeting. They had an observer to kind of keep an eye on what was being said. And what China wants is a multipolar financial world as well as a multipolar political world. And I certainly think that's a sensible thing for any country at this point to want. It should be sensible for the United States to want, but the people who have hijacked the government are not at all interested in sharing the pie with anybody. It's like the, Don Corleone, control of the quarter, and he's not going to yield to anybody. And the gang wars will be the consequence if you try.
Yeah, well, it's certainly the dollar being the king, the major global international currency ever since I guess you could say the spoils of World War II, and then when Nixon decided after to really destroy Bretton Woods, the Bretton Woods arrangement, which was still a fair arrangement in that it was tied to gold, and therefore the international dollar was not a political dollar per se, but it became that after Nixon took us off the gold standard and we went to a paper dollar, to a petrodollar essentially. That, to what extent do you think the arrangement with Saudi Arabia led to the wars? I mean, to what extent are all these wars that we're engaged in related to perpetuating the petrodollar?
Okay, Jay, if I can, I'd like to back up a little bit.
Sure.
Well before August 1971, when Nixon tore up my printer is complaining here in the background. When Nixon tore up the Bretton Woods Agreement and said the exchange window of the New York Fed will no longer give other central banks gold when they redeem their dollars for gold, as the rules of the Bretton Woods Treaty, which the United States Senate affirmed and the U.S. signed, that was just thrown in the wastebasket, which is highly undiplomatic and highly probably illegal, but no one dared to challenge the U.S. back then. Mm-hmm. But well before that, the U.S. was abusing the rules of the Bretton Woods Treaty by running deficits and printing money and inflating and exporting that inflation to the European economies, to the other members of the Bretton Woods Agreement.
Yes. And
refused to devalue the dollar. Jacques Rueff, de Gaulle's financial advisor, called for a 100% devaluation of the dollar during the Vietnam War in the mid-'60s to bring the world monetary system back into equilibrium. The dollar was never on a gold standard after 1944. Right. It was a gold exchange standard, and this is a very subtle and crucial difference. Every other country member of the Bretton Woods Treaty could exchange their currency for the dollar, and the dollar was the only currency that was pegged to gold. So what the U.S. did was say, we're not going to give you gold anymore, but we'll give you plenty of dollars. We'll even change what they're called. And the amount of dollars in circulation in the world since 1970, the best data I can get on that, going to about the year 2000, increased by 2,500%. So you wonder why that new Ford that you go to the car dealer and buy costs you $40,000, $45,000 today, when back in 1970 it would be worth about $4,000 or $5,000.
Right.
So that's the great inflation. And as long as the U.S. has the power to get away with that, they can literally get away with murder, which is what they've done with all these wars and everything else that the people who have no choice but to hold dollars as a reserve currency are forced to do.
Mm-hmm. But to what extent do you think that the wars that we're engaged in have to do with regime changes and making sure that people in power will continue to honor the dollar system, or let's say sell their oil for dollars, which is what Kissinger arranged with the OPEC, with
Sure.
Saudi Arabia and the OPEC countries?
Sure. Very much it has to do with the recent move by Washington to create a kind of a quasi-legal, but it was illegal really, Brazilian coup d'etat against Dilma Rousseff was to get rid of one of the key leading member countries of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. They had created a BRICS development bank that was a direct threat to the U.S.-controlled World Bank and IMF structures to control development around the world. And so she was a weaker link, far away from China and Russia, who are building beautiful infrastructure links and many other things to come closer together economically. So they, through completely illegal, unconstitutional means, created a coup d'etat against her. I don't think it will last, but this is what they're trying to do to save their system.
Yeah. Do you think the U.S. had some NGOs that were down there messing around, as we know?
Sure. All of the usual suspects.
Yeah.
Soros Foundation people, front groups, National Endowment for Democracy. And this time they did a little bit different tactic from what they did in Ukraine or Georgia or some of these other Eastern European countries. They got judges that were, in a sense, agents of influence of the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States of America. And those corrupt judges made these rulings. And the people who voted for impeachment were themselves involved in the corruption of Petrobras. She never has been documented or charged formally with a specific act of criminality in terms of Petrobras. So, this whole thing is a sham, but these guys voted for it to keep out of jail themselves. So that's very interesting because we've had John Perkins on this show, and he's talked about how it's beneficial for the CIA or the CIA to get people who have some dirt on, so they can use them as a leverage to make sure that they do what the CIA wants them to do. So do you think, just with respect to, we've seen a change of governments in Argentina, do you think that the U.S. might have had something to do with that, or some NGOs? No question. No question,
right?
Macri is to put it mildly, he's a fascist, but maybe that's his good side. Doesn't have much to recommend him other than the fact that he's controlled by Washington. That's the only thing positive for him in terms of the Obama administration.
Right. Okay. So you have the BRICS, and they were setting up this international system, banking system, and so forth. Is that still going forward? Is in your
sure.
understanding?
Sure.
And so you don't think this will be successful in destroying that? The efforts
I
by
don't,
the US?
because the toppling of Rousseff, which is not permanent unless they can find some charges to bring that will hold in the court system of Brazil. The Brazilian people are not exactly passive people, and that's clear in their carnival dances and music and so forth, and that's clear in their political going to the streets. And what happened during the Lula time and his successor Rousseff was lifting of something on the order of 35 million Brazilians out of abject poverty into a survival income, and that's a political base that is not about to see a bunch of free market, oligarchs take back the country from them. So it's by no means settled in Brazil. I think it was a desperate bid by the U.S. To try to weaken the BRICS, but it won't work.
Well, I would argue, William, and I don't know if you and I agree on this, but the oligarchs, by definition or by their nature, are anything but free market people. Generally, they tend to have connections in government that allow them to to gain the upper hand and to destroy the free market. So, but in any event,
I don't believe there's a free market anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
But the idea that market players can create markets, governments and private interests can create markets, that's certainly true. The so-called oligarchs, I call them patriarchs, like George Soros or Bill Gates or David Rockefeller, whatever names you want to give them, or Jacob Rothschild in the UK, they are anti-free enterprise or
yes, indefinitely are.
Yeah, and because they want to rig the rules of the game, they want to control the congressman, they want to buy the president, and that's what they've done successfully.
And that's what they do. All right, so now we're going, but in terms of, we've talked about the New Silk Road that you've talked about. How do the BRICS fit into the New Silk Road, if at all? I mean, because the BRICS, Brazil and South Africa, of course, there's Russia and India are there, and China are there, part of this New Silk Road.
Well, I would say, Jay, that the One Belt, One Road is a strategy for Eurasia. In fact, I've just completed a book called The Eurasian Century. And geographically, you have to work geographically. If that consolidates, and it is going ahead with dramatic speed in the last year and a half, high-speed rail links crisscrossing all of Eurasia, going through Russia, the Eurasian Economic Union of Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and so forth. It's going down to Iran. The presidency of China went down to Tehran some months ago and formally brought Iran, after the sanctions were lifted when they could do so, into the One Belt, One Road, the New Silk Road infrastructure project. They're building ports to guard the freedom of transport of goods to and from Eurasia or Asia, China especially. And the U.S. is not terribly happy about this, so Obama has created this Asia pivot, which is really a China pivot to encircle China and challenge or threaten China's protection of her freedom of the seas. So imagine that the U.S. would have such Chinese gunboats at their shores, threatening the passage of freight from around the world. That would
I don't think that would go over so well with the United States. But
no.
But here I have a question for you. First of all, what do you think? China's been amassing enormous amounts of gold. We've had estimates, not from the Chinese government, I think, tends to downplay the amount of gold they own. Perhaps they're hoping to continue to buy more of it cheaply. But we've said, estimates from upwards to 20 to 30,000 tons potentially. The Chinese people are encouraged to buy it. There's even advertisements for them to buy it. And you can go into any bank and buy gold. Russia, as you pointed out, is building up their gold reserves. How is gold playing into this geopolitical power structure? We've had a guest on this show that pointed out, he said that those countries can't compete with the United States now militarily, but what they can do is they can see that the United States dollar is very vulnerable, and they can engage in currency wars. Jim Rickards is who I'm talking about.
Sure, yeah.
Do you see that as a strategy? Do they see? Because here's the other question that I'd like to ask you is, why, if China has so much gold now, and I don't know if we know how much they have, but
we don't.
We don't know, but one good question from a friend of mine who asked me to ask you this: why doesn't China just pull the plug now on the United States? Rather than continue to hold treasuries or buy treasuries, and the funding of which is used then to expand the American military influence, overthrow governments, and put people in power that will make life more difficult for the Chinese and the Russians. Why don't the Chinese just pull the plug now?
Not being too facetious, I would say, in war as in love, timing is everything. And were the Chinese to do that now, they don't have the structures in place strategically, geopolitically, to withstand the shock of the collapse of $1.3 trillion, or maybe quite much more of that, of the U.S. dollar treasuries and Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and other junk paper that they're holding. So what would it bring them to do that now, other than a full-blown military confrontation with the West? And the Chinese, my knowledge of the Chinese, and I've been there many times since over the last 8 or 9 years, is that they are very reflective as a nation, as a leadership, and so forth. Sometimes very naive, although I have to say, the first time I went to China was right after the Tibetan protest before the Olympics in April of 2008. And the kind of government statements about the capitalist running dog Dalai Lama of Tibet, or blah, 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 were just embarrassing. And let's see, when was it? 2014, when we had the umbrella revolution in Hong Kong. The sophistication of the Chinese in understanding what is going on in the West and what is going on against them has gone light years in a very short time. They wrote an editorial in the China Daily, "Why does Washington always make color revolutions?" And they named the National Endowment for Democracy. They named the vice president of the NED, which is a U.S. government-financed destabilization entity that, in the quotes of its founder, does today what the CIA used to do 25 years ago or 50 years ago, Guatemala, Iran, and so forth. So they understand very well. I have had 6 or 7 of my books translated into Mandarin Chinese since 2008, and several of them have been in the top 10, nonfiction bestseller list. I don't say that to promote myself, but I say that to say I have helped, among many other voices, to educate the Chinese about how the West really functions. And when I first came there was incredible naivete. People had gone, over the last 25 years, had gone and studied at Harvard or MIT or Berkeley or George Washington University, and they really thought they had the inside track to tell China what to do. Now that is not accepted as a quality plus for Chinese intellectuals. That's considered an embarrassment.
Well, that's interesting because they were programmed here, of course, to continue on with the ruling elites program. And I wonder, with just a couple of minutes left here, William, the Chinese ruling elites, their children were being given cushy jobs by J.P. Morgan and the likes. That must still be an attempt to try to influence the policymakers in China to play ball with the United States as with the Anglo-American Empire as we would like them to, right? So we're continuing to try to infiltrate into those countries, into China and Russia, probably China more.
Absolutely, right? And the Western churches are just all over China. The Catholic Church, the Vatican was up to its ears in the umbrella revolution in Hong Kong, aimed to embarrass Beijing. Every which way they can try. They're trying to destabilize from within and militarily challenge from without that China is.
All right. Well, William, we're out of time. I have to ask you one quick question. Do you see this as bullish for gold, what's going on in terms of the gold in terms of U.S. dollars?
I love gold so much you can't imagine, Jay.
All right. You've answered my question.
Not only because of that, but because it's the most beautiful metal in the entire atomic.
Well, it's the most beautiful metal, and it's also the most honest money. It is a non-political money. So, to the extent that the Chinese are building a monetary base, the Chinese, the Russians, these countries are building. India loves gold. I think that we have a chance for a much better world if we get the money creation out of the hands of the ruling elite who are using it to rob and pillage and wage wars. So, William, always good to have you with me. We are out of time right now. I want to thank you so much and encourage people to go to williamengdahl.com.